Hello, welcome to Shad Life. I want to continue my series on my BMX story. Um, I talked a little bit about the very beginning when I first got into BMX, but in this episode, I want to talk about freestyle and how I got into freestyle and kind of what led up to it. Um, I would go into the junior high library and they actually had BMX Action magazine in the library. That was so cool because I didn't have a subscription. Believe it or not, I couldn't afford it. It's pretty interesting how little money I had. And I think back and I'm just like, man, how did I even get by? Like, my parents didn't have a lot of money and so on and so forth. So I would go into the library. Thank goodness they had it. And I'd go in there and pick up the magazine from the little magazine thing, and I would read that thing cover to cover. It might take me a couple of days, whatever, but I was obsessed with that magazine. And so BMX Action, if, throughout the early '80s, would have like Bob Harrell and the BMX Action Trick Team, which was R.L. Osborne and Mike Buff, and one of the reasons I want to tell my story is I want to tell it from like a kid's perspective or a rider's perspective, like just getting into the sport, rather than talking about it from like a professional's perspective. I see all these interviews, but they're always interviews of these famous top riders, and there's not very many people talking about their personal experience of what was going on with BMX back then. And for me, it was like a life changing experience. It was a game changer. It shaped who I became throughout the rest of my life and still affects me to this day. Obviously, you can tell because of my YouTube channel and what I do on it, right? So, in the early 80s, I had a couple of bikes and I was going and, I was trying to race, but we didn't have a lot of money to race. To get me to the racetrack and things like that. And I always kind of had like a subpar bike and everything. And so I would start learning to do tricks. The bunny hop is obvious. I learned how to do that at a pretty young age. But started learning to do like endos. In the magazine, I'd see curb endos where they'd ride up into the curb and do a big endo and stuff like that. And seeing these tricks. So my friend Steve and I, who was kind of my like counterpart, like him and I were like best friends and we were obsessed with BMX. I remember one day we decided we wanted to learn how to ride backwards on our handlebars. And I remember the bike I had. I had a Rampart R11. It was a race bike, but I had blue Skyway Tough wheels on it. And we went to a local park on a baseball diamond, and we just spent hours just learning we'd start sitting backwards on our handlebars and learning how to pedal and ride backwards on our handlebars. I wish I had photos or any media of that time of my life, but I don't. Unfortunately, it was just at a time when we didn't have cell phones, we didn't have cameras everywhere, right? So we just practice and practice and practice until we got it down. And then once we could just indefinitely ride backwards on our handlebars, we were super stoked. And that was the kind of thing we did. We'd hang out and just session until we learned certain tricks and things. We did the same thing with rollbacks, and we had another friend of ours, Kobe, who was from the neighboring city, who rode with us quite a bit, and we would go and do rollbacks on this bank, and we'd just keep practicing, and it's like, well, we got to the end of the little parking lot. Okay, well, now let's learn how to steer out of the parking lot and go down the road like that. It was so fun. That was a little bit later, but coming back right around, I'd say, 83, the magazines, BMX Action was starting to show like some new bikes coming out and freestyle bikes and things like that. And it's like, what are these? Like, we always just modified our race bikes, but now they're coming out with actual freestyle bikes. We were obsessed. We were looking at ads. And then in 84, they split. The same company, Wizard Publications, that did BMX Action, came out with a magazine called Freestyle. And I remember the first issue. I actually got a subscription right at that time. I was able to afford it because I turned 16. And once I turned 16, I was able to get like a real job, I guess, McDonald's, if you call that a real job for a kid in high school. That's a pretty big deal. And so I was able to like buy my own stuff. And I remember this ad with RL behind the Redline RL20. I was obsessed with that bike. I had to have it, and the local bike shop had it, and I saved up my money from McDonald's and went and bought one. And so in 84, I had a Redline RL20, one of the first freestyle bikes, the official first freestyle bike, which my friend Steve purchased, was the Haro Freestyler. He was the first one to really get a freestyle bike in our area. The original Haro Freestyler, and built that thing up. I want to say it had white tufts on it, if I remember right. And then I got the Redline shortly after, which was a complete. He had to custom build his bike because they didn't really make the Haro Freestyler in a complete yet. And then I got the Redline as a complete, and boom, there we were. Freestyling away, learning tricks. And one of my favorite tricks to learn, I knew how to do endos, but like R.L. Osborne, who was probably one of the riders I was pretty obsessed with back then, he could do front wheel hops like forever. I remember him talking about doing like 99 of them. So I learned how to do front wheel hops on that Redline, and I just, we went out, Steve checked out a camera that had a zoom lens where you could adjust it from the high school. And another thing that's awesome is we couldn't afford a really nice SLR camera. So we checked one out from, the high school. And of course, this is in the day when it was film. There was no digital photography back then. And we went to this flat lot that was across the street from where I lived, where I always practiced flatland, and we had a photo session. And these are some pictures from that photo session. And I had two bikes at that time. Like, I was racing and I was freestyling, so I had a race bike and a freestyle bike. And that was kind of that time where it was like I've always had multiple bikes from that day forward. I never just had one bike, which is kind of funny. But yeah, some of these tricks are me on my GT race bike, and some of them are on my Redline. And I kind of had this thing where my race bike was what I would go jumping with, racing with, do dirt with, and then my freestyle bike, I didn't want to ever take it into the dirt because I felt like that would make the brakes not work and stuff like that. I didn't want it to get dirty, so I was pretty picky about that. And if I showed up at the trails or rode home from school and went to the trails, I would always go home first, grab my race bike, and then go to the trails. I would never take my freestyle bike on the trails. It's kind of funny. So yeah, that was it. We were really obsessed. This photo session that we did was so cool. We had photos of us doing these tricks, and I was learning stuff. I was kind of making stuff up, like the backwards bunny hop, where I'd be backwards on my handlebars and bunny hop. And speaking of that, after we learned how to ride backwards on the handlebars, I did learn how to ride into it. So I'd basically jump over, switch my foot over to the other pedal, and then turn and sit and get into it backwards and get into it, and then kind of reverse and get back to normal without getting off the bike. So that was cool because I could just go to riding backwards. I was doing frame stands where I'm standing on the frame no-handed, front wheel hops, and so on and so forth. And then it just evolved, and then I got way into freestyle. So that was it. Like, the magazines really helped kind of drive people like myself and Steve and stuff to just into the sport. I would read those magazines cover to cover, and it was so cool to just experience that as a kid and be part of that. And that was what I just fell in love with, and it's still here with me today. So that's what I find amazing. I have a lot of friends that, once they turned 16, 17, got their first car, whatever, they were done with BMX. They didn't want anything to do with it. They were all about the girls and the cars and this and that. But Steve, myself, Kobe, a few others are in our group, we all stuck with it for quite a while. And it was just really cool. So next episode, I'll kind of talk about kind of where things went after that. But yeah, this was kind of that prime time where I really shifted and just, I knew BMX was what I was going to do for a very long time at this point. And I remember I was like 18 or maybe 19 by the time because I was kind of at that age where I was still a senior when I was 19. And we got in the yearbook doing tricks. I wish I had photos of that. And someone asked me, oh, when, aren't you too old for this? When are you going to quit, right? And I was like, 18, 19 years old, and somebody's asking me if I'm telling me I'm too old for BMX. I was like, I'll never be too old for it. I knew back then that it's kind of wild thinking about it. I knew way back then that I was never going to be too old for BMX. And here I am today, 56 years old, still ride my BMX bike. Appreciate your support for my channel. Please like and subscribe. Peace.